Let's begin with President Biden's stark warning about Russia. He said the world is at its highest risk of a nuclear, quote, Armageddon since the darkest days of the Cold War. The president's dire warning coming after Vladimir Putin threatened the West with nuclear weapons and ordered the mobilization of 300,000 Russian troops to fight in his war against Ukraine. Speaking at a fundraiser in New York, the president said this: "We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis. We are trying to figure out, what is Putin's off-ramp? Where does he find a way out?" He's not joking when he talks about potential use of tactical nuclear weapons or biological or chemical weapons. Kennedy, what is your first response to this? And do you think, after 50 years of foreign policy and some of the mishaps we've seen him make, that people may just take a breath before they take all this in?
I think that the president should have taken a breath before he vocalized this, instead of talking with, having our diplomats speak with Russian diplomats, because that is the avenue these things should be addressed. And if you're talking about an off-ramp, which is what we should be talking about, we should be figuring out ways to end this conflict. Those are the conversations. We should be having more conversations about an off-ramp in Ukraine than we are about Brittany Griner. Also very important, but, the Brittany Griner case could not lead to nuclear annihilation. This potentially might, but also the president freestyling here about tactical nuclear weapons leading to Armageddon. Saying that out loud, I look at this and I'm wondering, is this pushing Putin further into a corner? How is this helping the situation? Does this kind of talk lead to de-escalation? If not, if he's trying to appear tough, is that the result? And I don't feel like it is. I think this is another foreign policy misstep.
I don't know if a fundraiser is necessarily where you begin your toughness. Maybe you do that at the UN, on the world stage, something like that. But, a zip code's a zip code, I suppose. Emily, the point that Kennedy makes is so crystal clear. It is that idea of let your diplomats do this kind of talk in case you might make a mistake, in case you might say something incendiary that would push him further into a corner and make him, if he could possibly be, any more desperate.
That's right. And I see two big issues with this. One being exactly what you just articulated, and then the second being the forum. To your point about the freestyling, we rely on our commander-in-chief and the president of the United States to be diplomatic, meaning relying on his cadre of diplomats to do that behind-the-scenes negotiation for him. And also, wouldn't that be more appropriate for the State of the Union address, for something from coming out of the Oval Office, somewhere big, if he is truly going to invoke Armageddon, rather than a Democratic elected official fundraiser at a private home? And once again, the White House and his team has to clean up. They have to walk back. In fact, CNN reporting that a senior defense official expressed surprise, saying, we haven't had signs actually of any escalation whatsoever. So not only did he sort of put another one in the lane of his minor incursion gaffe and this guy cannot remain in power gaffe, but now he actually invoked Armageddon, which is horrifying. And again, the American people are left to be surprised, afraid, and then, oh, wait, he didn't mean it, per the White House.
Well, okay, so just backstop on that for 1 second with this question. So when you say that they hadn't seen escalation, did he pull it out of whole cloth? Is it fantasy? Is he, what's going on?
Well, so the CNN reporting, a senior U.S. government official expressed surprise at the president's remarks, saying there were no obvious signs of an escalating threat from Russia.
Okay, that's pretty clear.
Well, you listen to General Jack Keane on this very topic, and what he says is that what Putin is doing right now by threatening nukes is he is trying to instill fear. And he wants the United States and the West to stop supporting Ukraine as significantly as we are right now. But really, it does come down to a cost-benefit analysis that Putin is even going through right now. And the cost would be great. Ukraine has even said that they would continue this fight if Putin, unleashes a nuclear weapon on a portion of their battlefield. It would bring NATO even closer into this war, which is not good for Russia. Also not good for Russia is the fact that if you do put a nuke on the battlefield, the wind blows towards that country. So that should all ease everybody's mind. What doesn't ease my mind, though, is what Kennedy was talking about, how Vladimir Putin has no intention of losing this war, and right now he is. He's also losing support at home. He just annexed 4 territories of Ukraine, and as he was signing those papers, Ukraine was going in and reclaiming that territory once again.
Yeah.
Thousands of Russians are fleeing the country because they want to avoid this draft. So right now, Putin is sort of like a trapped rat, and he never thought that he would be in this position.
Real quickly about the thousands who are fleeing Russia now. Some of them are going to Alaska. And that's such an interesting juxtaposition of where we are in this situation.
Yeah, it certainly is. Also interesting is that the state media in Russia is also starting to criticize how this war is going. And it's state media. You didn't even know that they could do this. So there are people that are really putting their lives on the line by saying this needs to stop.
Yeah, can they do this and live?
Yes.
Before I come to you, I want to put this up on the screen. We've got quite a few of President Biden's foreign policy blunders. You know, we do these montage things. Can we do that right now? Let's take a peek at that, and then I'll go to Joe.
So unlike Ukraine, to be clear, sir, U.S. forces, U.S. men and women would defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion.
Yes.
Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
You are.
That's the commitment we made. Ukraine will never be a victory for Russia. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, et cetera. But if they actually do what they're capable of doing with the force amassed on the border, it is going to be a disaster for Russia.
So, as I said off the very top of this hour, 50 years of foreign policy, people might take a pause. Kennedy said the president should take a pause. Maybe we all should.
We should, and we should read the words of Robert Gates. Who is that? That is the defense secretary who served in the Obama-Biden administration. And he said, quote, and I talk about it in my book, by the way, Come On Man. All right, and this is about the truth about Joe Biden's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad presidency. He has been wrong about every foreign policy decision he's ever made. The first Gulf War he voted against. That was the one to get Saddam out of Kuwait that everybody liked. The second Gulf War regarding weapons of mass destruction, he voted for, then denied voting for it. When Barack Obama called Joe Biden into the Oval Office, when they knew they had bin Laden in Pakistan, they said, Joe, what should we do? And Joe Biden said, I don't think we should go in, sir. Literally the only person within the cabinet who voted against doing that internally, and Obama thankfully ignored him, and we got bin Laden. So overall, look, when he was a senator, he was one of 100 in a chamber, didn't have a lot of power. When he was vice president, symbolic position. Now he's president. He has power. His words matter, and it doesn't seem to impact him in terms of being, to Kennedy's point, careful with your words when people are talking about using nuclear weapons, Harris.
Yeah, and words like Armageddon.
Yes.
That really connote the end. And the end of what exactly?
The world.
We can't lose. Right. The world can't lose. The madman has to. But the way he's putting this, the madman has more power. He's got our president saying words like Armageddon.
Yeah.
And like I think the word used before, he's like a trapped rat at this point. And General Wesley Clark has a great column in the New York Post today. He talks about how Putin's military's morale is exceedingly low, soldiers in disarray, winter's coming, they're going to even be less effective, they're losing territory, protests are growing back home. And to your point, Carly, for state media to start criticizing this president, you're not only putting your career on the line, you're putting your life on the line. That's when you know things are bad.
Well, come on, Joe.
Come on, man.
Show me your book. Talk about it.
There you go. What do you think? It's a very colorful cover, I have to say.
And it looks fantastic
in the game right now.
It is.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Wall Street Journal bestseller list, so we're very happy about that. First book. Who knew?
So what is the premise of the book? It's like things that he said, things that he...
It looks back at his entire life from when he was a young adult in law school, when he claimed he was top of his class, and he was actually at the bottom of his class, and how he has failed upwards his entire life. Now, usually when you fail upwards, you hit a ceiling at some point.
Right.
This guy got somewhere where only 46 people have ever occupied the Oval Office. And it talks about the media who helped put him there, not just traditional media, but social media as well, and that collusion that we saw in that campaign. So a lot to talk about in the book, and it was fun to write. We'll put it that way. A lot of material to work with.
Congrats on your success.
Thanks, appreciate it, man.
All right.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Compagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.